Beneath the official histories and victory parades lies another war, one fought in shadows, where truth was smothered under layers of ink and ash. Here, nations bartered in stolen science, silenced witnesses, and the quiet erasure of entire events. The records that remain are torn, blacked out, and whispered about only in guarded rooms, because some secrets were never meant to see daylight. At 3:14 on the morning of March 17, 1946, in the shattered rail yards of Königsberg, a sealed DRB freight wagon was coupled to a short, three-car train headed west. The paperwork identified the load as Landwirtschaftlich Gerät, agricultural machinery, bound for a Soviet military depot in Białystok. Yet the guards assigned to the shipment were not Soviet Red Army regulars. Their uniforms bore Red Army insignia, but the cut of their tunics, the polish of their boots, and the precise, clipped German they spoke to one another told a different story. Post-war intelligence analysts would later note that each man had served in SS Sturmbannführer Heinrich Boehmer's 9th Sonderabteilung, last recorded in the Königsberg region in late January. The train moved slowly under overcast skies, passing through bombed-out towns still smoldering from the end of the war. At Insterburg, it was met by two additional Soviet flatcars carrying ZIS-5 trucks. Official rail logs from the Soviet military administration show no such addition, yet a British aerial reconnaissance photograph taken that afternoon clearly depicts the longer consist. These inconsistencies, initially dismissed as clerical noise in chaotic post-war movements, became central to the file that MI6 would later classify under the codename Dämmerung. By late evening, the train reached a disused spur north of Białystok, adjacent to an abandoned timber facility. There, according to a single surviving witness, a Polish station hand named Stefan Komura, interviewed by the Ministry of Public Security in 1947, the freight wagon was detached and left under guard while the rest of the train continued east. Komura described the guards as hard-eyed men with foreign weapons, and recalled a faint, metallic humming emanating from inside the sealed wagon. Within days, both the wagon and the guards were gone. Soviet archival fragments hint at an internal investigation. A March 26, 1946, cable from the NKVD's Transport Security Directorate references Item 47K, being transferred under Directive 672/Alpha to a technical storage site outside Minsk. No record of Directive 672/Alpha survives in Belarusian archives. British intelligence cross-referenced 47K with captured German documents recovered from Peenemünde West, where Reich research had touched upon mercury-based propulsion experiments for unconventional aircraft. Those files, already fragmentary after the RAF's 1943 bombing raids, contained references to Kugel aggregate, spherical reaction chambers, said to require high-purity mercury and rare earth alloys. Local Polish accounts from the late 1940s describe unsettling phenomena near the timber facility's spur. Komura's niece, interviewed in 1965, spoke of her uncle warning children to stay indoors at night, citing lights that burned without sound drifting over the treeline. Several villagers claimed livestock were found dead without visible wounds, their eyes clouded white. The Polish Security Service treated these as superstition, though two internal memos, declassified only in 1991, record field officers observing unusual luminescent activity over the forest in November 1946. The Western Allies took a quiet but sustained interest. In 1952, CIA Station Warsaw tasked an operative under commercial cover to locate the spur. His report, filed under Dämmerung 6, confirms the spur existed but was overgrown and blocked by Soviet concrete barriers. The surrounding forest showed signs of shallow, circular clearings, each approximately 20 meters across, with scorched earth in the center. Soil samples smuggled back to West Berlin contained elevated mercury levels and traces of yttrium oxide. The operative's report ends abruptly after this analysis. His next known posting was Saigon, where he died in a road accident within the year. From the Soviet side, the trail effectively ends in 1949. That year, a classified Aeronautical Research Bureau document makes a cryptic reference to Test Platform K in relation to high-altitude lift trials. No location is given, but a margin note in pencil, believed to be the handwriting of engineer Sergei Korolev, reads simply, German work, unstable core. Korolev's surviving papers omit any further mention. In 1978, a Polish forestry worker clearing land near the old spur uncovered a corroded metal plate bearing a stylized eagle clutching a ring, partially overstruck by a Soviet five-pointed star. The item was seized by military police within hours. The worker later told his son he was questioned for 2 days by men from Warsaw and warned never to return to the site. Satellite imagery from the early 1980s shows that the forest around the spur was systematically cleared and replanted in grid formation, a pattern consistent with Soviet techniques for concealing military facilities from overhead reconnaissance. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Polish journalists attempted to investigate, but were met with sealed Ministry of Defense archives. Requests under the new Freedom of Information laws returned the same 3-word reply: material not found. The last verifiable lead comes from 1994, when a retired GRU officer, speaking anonymously to a German documentary crew, claimed that Item 47K was not a weapon in the usual sense, but an engine, the kind no one was ready for. He refused to elaborate, ending the interview with a warning: some machines should never run again. The Königsberg freight wagon, the guards in Soviet uniform, the vanishing cargo, all remain locked in the intersecting shadows of post-war chaos, Cold War secrecy, and the missing fragments of both. The file marked Dämmerung sits today in the British National Archives, still partially redacted, its blacked-out sections shielding a story that has evaded conclusion for nearly 80 years. At 8:42 on February 9, 1951, a U.S. Navy P-2V-3W Neptune patrol aircraft lifted off from NAS Keflavik, Iceland, under heavy overcast. Designated Bureau Number 122465, the aircraft was part of Patrol Squadron 6, tasked with an anti-submarine sweep in the Barents Sea. Its route, filed through NATO channels, would take it northeast toward Norwegian territorial waters before curving toward the Soviet exclusion zone for a routine electronic reconnaissance pass. The last radio contact came at 12:16 Universal Time Coordinated, a short transmission from the aircraft's commander, Lieutenant Commander Henry S. Dobson: ice drift heavier than charted. Adjusting course 2 points starboard. Will report next mark in 20. No further messages followed. When Neptune 122465 failed to report its position by 12:45, Keflavik initiated the standard lost aircraft procedure. Official records later attributed the loss to severe winter weather and possible airframe icing. Yet within 48 hours, both the CIA's Office of Special Operations and Britain's GCHQ had quietly requested all signal intercepts from the Murmansk region for the period of the disappearance. This unusual cross-agency urgency was never explained to the squadron's families. The first classified lead came not from NATO, but from a Finnish merchant captain whose log was seized by the Finnish Defense Forces in March 1951. The captain had recorded sighting 2 Soviet Kronstadt-class subchasers idling near the ice edge north of Novaya Zemlya on the day of the disappearance. His crew reported hearing a low, repeated concussion, followed by the sudden appearance of aircraft debris on the floe, a torn section of wing bearing the U.S. Navy star and red bars. In 1993, after the dissolution of the USSR, a tranche of KGB naval communications was partially declassified. Among them was a February 1951 memo to the Northern Fleet Command referencing the downing of an unidentified foreign reconnaissance craft during Operation Snow Curtain. The memo stated the aircraft had been engaged by a Yak-9 interceptor after it approached the recovery zone of Special Object R-16. The nature of R-16 was not explained, but coordinates in the margin placed it less than 2 nautical miles from the wreck site of German U-boat U-739. Sunk in April 1945 under circumstances never disclosed to the Kriegsmarine High Command. U-739's mission remains one of the least understood of the late war period. Kriegsmarine construction records list it as a Type IXC/40, but Soviet naval intelligence believed it had been modified for special long-range cargo. When the Soviets sank it, no bodies were recovered, and the wreck was kept under armed guard for months despite its location beneath shifting Arctic ice. In 1967, a Soviet Navy diver who defected to Sweden claimed he had participated in a covert dive on the wreck in the early 1950s. He described metallic crates stored in the forward torpedo room, each stenciled with Gothic script markings alongside Cyrillic inventory codes. Before the team could surface, an officer ordered all remaining hatches sealed and the compartment flooded, entombing the cargo. The diver alleged this was to prevent NATO recovery after the Neptune's incursion. The U.S. Navy never admitted any link between Neptune 122465 and the U-739 wreck, but surviving members of VP-6 recall a sudden, unexplained increase in Barents Sea patrols in the months before the disappearance. One crewman, aviation machinist's mate First Class Robert M. Crow, told his family decades later that, "We were flying the same lines over and over, like someone was trying to catch a shadow under the ice." In 1988, Norwegian fishing trawler Nordlys snagged a large object on its nets 35 kilometers south of the recorded Neptune crash area. The crew recovered a mangled aluminum panel, its rivet pattern matching Lockheed Neptune specifications. The panel bore faint scorch marks inconsistent with fire but consistent with high-voltage arcing. Norwegian authorities quietly passed the item to NATO's submarine command in Northwood, UK. It has not been seen since. Additional anomalies deepened the mystery. A 1952 CIA memorandum, declassified in 2001, notes heightened Soviet radio silence protocols in the Barents sector for 72 hours following the Neptune incident. Satellite sea ice imagery from the 1970s, when first declassified for civilian use, reveals an area of consistently thinner ice cover directly over the U-739 coordinates, a thermal anomaly suggestive of ongoing underwater activity. In the early 1990s, a retired Soviet signals officer told a BBC investigative crew that the cargo of U-739 was German science, not weapons, at least not in the way people think. He refused further comment but confirmed that Operation Snow Curtain was designed to shield R-16 from Western eyes, whatever it took. When pressed on whether Neptune 122465 had been intentionally destroyed, the officer replied, "We didn't sink an American plane that day. We sank a question." The loss of Neptune 122465 remains officially listed as an accident. No remains were recovered, no wreckage conclusively tied to the crash has been publicly shown, and no explanation has been offered for why a patrol plane's disappearance in Arctic weather triggered such a prolonged and classified intelligence response. The confluence of a missing U.S. aircraft, a guarded German wreck, and the still unexplained special object R-16 leaves Operation Snow Curtain suspended in the same polar silence that swallowed the Neptune's final transmission. On the night of April 7, 1945, as American forces advanced through the Harz Mountains, the 1st Battalion, 22nd Infantry Regiment, 4th U.S. Infantry Division, intercepted a garbled signal on a captured German field set. It was a transmission in low-speed Morse, originating from somewhere south of Wernigerode, repeating the phrase, "Nebel word fallen, fog will fall." This was the last known broadcast from Einsatzgruppe Nebel, an SS special unit tasked with erasing all evidence of a subterranean complex hidden beneath the granite spine of the Harz. 2 days later, at 6:30, a combined force of the U.S. 22nd Infantry and attached CIC, Counterintelligence Corps agents followed an informant, a gaunt, feverish man who identified himself only by the codename Larkspur, to a camouflaged steel hatch set into a quarry face outside the village of Elbingerode. Larkspur claimed the site was part of Projekt Silberschatten, Silver Shadow, a research effort focused on a weapon that could kill a city without dropping a single bomb. The hatch was wired with demolition charges, but the firing cable had been hastily cut. Inside, the air was acrid, thick with the stench of scorched paper. The complex, built into 2 descending tunnels, showed signs of deliberate sabotage: collapsed sections, burned document rooms, smashed glassware. Yet amid the wreckage, CIC agents recovered several partially charred folders bearing the stamp of the SS Führungsamt technical branch. These files referred to elektromagnetische Entkopplung, electromagnetic decoupling, and Großraumfeldversuch, large area field trials. One surviving blueprint fragment depicted a generator array surrounded by concentric copper rings, with handwritten notes suggesting city-scale deployment possible within 30 minutes of activation. By April 9th, elements of the 3rd Armored Division had secured the surrounding area. Witness interviews with local civilians described weeks of unusual night activity. Convoys arriving without headlights, guards wearing full protective masks, and a faint, rhythmic hum that could be felt through the ground. Several villagers claimed their hair had fallen out in clumps after visiting the quarry to barter for coal. The Americans ordered an immediate excavation of the collapsed tunnel sections. In the third gallery, engineers found a pair of massive, water-cooled transformers connected to thick, tarred cables running deeper underground, cables that had been severed and removed beyond the 40-meter mark. The cut ends were clean, as if done with industrial shears, not explosives. No trace of the main device described in the surviving plans was located. On April 12, Larkspur was found dead in his temporary billet in Frankfurt. The official report described suicide by ingestion of corrosive acid, though no container was recovered. His room had been searched, his identification papers gone, and the only surviving photograph of him, taken during the quarry operation, was removed from the 22nd Infantry's records sometime in the early 1950s. In its place, a typed note was filed, identity expunged per Directive 546. The Silberschatten files recovered from the site were flown directly to London under US-British joint custody. In 1957, during a closed-door session of the House Subcommittee on Research and Development, Representative William H. Bates referred obliquely to a German device capable of producing non-explosive citywide power failures via resonant field projection. This statement was stricken from the public record within 24 hours, and no further mention of the project appears in congressional archives. In East Germany, the Stasi maintained a parallel file on the Harz complex. According to defected officer Gunter Mahler, the GDR believed that Soviet NKVD units had recovered a functional component from the site in late 1945, possibly a control module, which was then transferred to a technical institute outside Leningrad. Soviet records from the Ministry of Media Machine Building list several experimental trials of high-intensity electromagnetic devices in the late 1940s, though the terminology was deliberately vague. An American aerial reconnaissance photo from September 1952 shows that the quarry site had been flooded, either by deliberate damming or natural seepage, rendering the tunnels inaccessible. However, magnetometer readings taken during a 1971 geological survey still registered anomalously high fields around the former hatch location. In 1983, a declassified British Ministry of Defence briefing for internal use admitted that the precise function of Silberschatten remains undetermined, but warned that field effects of similar amplitude could, in theory, be replicated with advances in pulsed power systems. The briefing also noted that certain recovered copper ring segments were kept at a secure installation in Wiltshire, and that these pieces exhibited unexplained residual magnetization decades after recovery. Today, all surviving documentation on Einsatzgruppe Nebel's mission is fragmented, heavily redacted, or scattered among Allied and former Warsaw Pact archives. The official U.S. Army history of the 22nd Infantry in Europe makes no mention of the Albingerode operation, the quarry hatch, or Larkspur. The Silberschatten project sits at the intersection of wartime desperation, cutting-edge physics, and the enduring opacity of Cold War secrecy, a shadow within a shadow, where the truth has been buried as deeply as the device it once concealed. In July 1962, while the world's attention was fixed on Cuba, a four-man SIS detachment arrived at Thule Air Base in northwest Greenland under the cover of a joint British-Danish meteorological survey. The team's real mission, codenamed Frostveil, was to locate and retrieve Artifact Epsilon, a device reportedly abandoned by a German weather station in 1944 and later buried under glacial ice. The trail began with a German Navy meteorological outpost, Wetterstelle Haifisch, established on the Kronprinz Christian Land Peninsula in late 1943. According to captured Kriegsmarine logs, the station was tasked not only with transmitting weather data to U-boat command, but also with testing the broadcast fidelity of device Epsilon under polar ionospheric conditions. Post-war interrogations of surviving personnel yielded no clear description of the device, only guarded references to a transmitter that spoke to the ice. The British interest was sparked in 1959 when a Danish geological survey field team inadvertently detected a faint, repeating signal on an obsolete VLF receiver while conducting seismic measurements east of the Petermann Glacier. The pulses were regular, spaced exactly 9.3 seconds apart, and persisted for several hours before fading. Cross-checking the coordinates placed the source within 30 kilometers of the documented position of Wetterstelle Hayfish. Under Frostveil, the SIS team, led by Commander Alec Fairchild, was equipped with deep ice augers, portable VLF antennas, and a compact power generator modified for Arctic use. Their mission was to bore through up to 60 meters of ice to reach the suspected burial site. Danish authorities were told the operation was for glacial core sampling. The Real directive, according to a partially declassified Foreign Office cable, was to recover any intact components, schematics, or samples, and transport them via RAF C-130 to a secure facility in the UK. Initial progress was slow but uneventful. On August 2nd, after 6 days of drilling, the team encountered a metallic object embedded in opaque ice. Fairchild's field notes, now held in the SIS historical section, describe it as a spherical housing, approximate 1.4 meters diameter, constructed of an unfamiliar alloy, possibly aluminum magnesium but with anomalous resistance to the auger bit. Before further cutting could be attempted, the sphere emitted a low-frequency pulse that was picked up on the team's headphones, matching the 9.3-second interval recorded in 1959. The event coincided with the sudden onset of a katabatic windstorm, which forced the team to halt operations and secure the camp. By the following morning, 2 members, Communications Officer Lieutenant Peter Hargreaves and Engineer Sven Larsson, were missing. Their sleeping bags were undisturbed, and no footprints were visible beyond the tent line, only wind-scoured snow. Fairchild's report states that he and the remaining agent attempted to re-establish contact with Thule but found their radio crippled by continuous interference, a low hum punctuated by the same rhythmic pulses, now stronger than before. The decision was made to abandon the drilling site and retreat to the coast for pickup. The last page of the field log reads, "Signal persists even when antenna removed. Origin unclear. Epsilon may be active." A debriefing memorandum dated August 17, 1962, filed under Frostveil/Endphase, lists the operation as aborted due to environmental hazard, and omits any mention of the sphere or the missing men. Danish Defense Ministry cables from the same period, declassified in 2004, reference a temporary restriction on scientific access to the Petermann Glacier area due to unexploded ordnance risk, a cover story never publicly corrected. Subsequent attempts to revisit the site met with unexplained setbacks. In 1967, a U.S. Air Force weather reconnaissance flight recorded anomalous magnetic readings over the same coordinates. In 1975, a Canadian glaciology team reported equipment failures and pervasive audio interference on all HF and VLF bands during a survey in the vicinity. Both incidents were logged but never followed up. When the Danish Defense Command digitized its archival holdings in the 1990s, an internal index revealed a sealed file titled Epsilon, Communication MITEIS, Epsilon, Communication with ICE, marked Opgaven annulleret, Ingen Gensten fundet, Mission cancelled, no objects found. The physical file was absent from the shelves. To this day, monitoring stations in northern Greenland and Ellesmere Island occasionally report faint, repetitive signals on extremely low frequencies, often during winter storms, always from the same general bearing. While these could be natural phenomena, the timing, interval, and endurance of the pulses remain difficult to reconcile with known geophysical processes. The whereabouts of artifact Epsilon, the fate of Hargreaves and Larsson, and the true purpose of Wetterstelle Hayfish's ice transmitter are locked beneath decades of ice and secrecy. For those who have heard the surviving recordings, a deep, metallic tone resonating through the static at precise 9-second intervals, the sensation is not unlike a heartbeat. On May 10, 1945, 3 days after Germany's formal surrender, an OSS team led by Captain Warren L. Dunbar entered a disused Wehrmacht storage bunker outside Innsbruck, Austria. The operation, conducted under the cover of recovering stolen art and gold, instead uncovered 32 leather-bound journals belonging to Reich scientist Dr. Otto Falkenhayn, formerly of the Luftwaffe's Forschungsamt. The journals, written in Falkenhayn's precise Gothic hand, documented a program designated Projekt Morgenstern, a theoretical means of weaponizing low-orbit atmospheric phenomena for precision bombardment without conventional explosives. Falkenhayn's entries began in late 1942, referencing atmospheric compression nodes, and artificial ignition of auroral channels, terms unknown in Allied physics at the time. Several diagrams depicted long, cylindrical projectors mounted on rail carriages, aimed at the upper atmosphere, annotated with calculations involving megavolt discharges and charged particle streams. An entry dated December 8, 1944, noted that a pilot ignition over Reval had produced light and shock across 70 kilometers, satisfactory. No corroborating record of such an event exists in Estonian or Soviet wartime reports. The OSS secured the journals in a metal document chest, assigned to Courier Lieutenant James F. Harlan for transport to the Paris OSS station. Harlan departed Innsbruck on May 12 in a standard-issue Willis MB Jeep, accompanied by Sergeant Anthony Rizzo as driver. The convoy was unremarkable, a mixture of supply trucks and intelligence vehicles, until it reached a switchback road near the Brenner Pass. At approximately 1640, the Jeep failed to rejoin the column after a fog bank rolled in. A search party found the vehicle an hour later, nose down in a shallow ravine. The engine was still idling, headlights on, but both Harlan and Rizzo were missing. The document chest was not in the Jeep. There were no footprints leading away from the site, only disturbed gravel at the road's edge, as if the vehicle had been forced to the shoulder. The official after-action report cited accidental loss during convoy movement, but internally the OSS classified the incident as a probable interception. In the weeks that followed, OSS counterintelligence intercepted 2 separate cables from Soviet NKVD field offices in Vienna. Both referenced acquisition of German aeronomic research and Morgenstern apparatus notes. The NKVD files were never recovered, and Soviet scientific literature of the late 1940s contains no overt mention of atmospheric weaponization, though several classified Soviet projects in auroral physics emerged during that period. By 1948, Morgenstern's name appeared in a restricted USAF budget request for upper atmosphere excitation studies, filed under the innocuous title Project Lantern. The attached briefing acknowledged theoretical basis derived from foreign wartime research, but gave no source. No funding was allocated, and the program's paper trail ends there. Falkenhayn himself was never located. A single Red Cross tracing inquiry in 1946 suggested he may have been evacuated from Prague by air in April 1945 aboard a Heinkel He-177. The manifest of that flight is missing from Luftwaffe archives, and Soviet military records from captured Prague airfields make no mention of it. In 1961, during an internal review of unprocessed wartime material, a CIA archivist discovered a misfiled photographic negative labeled Morgenstern Test Rig, Piemont? The image showed a massive, angled platform with a parabolic structure mounted on rails, surrounded by snowdrifts. 3 figures in heavy coats stood at its base, their faces obscured. Attempts to match the background to known German test ranges were inconclusive, but the structure's scale suggested a device capable of launching energy into the upper atmosphere. The final trace of the missing OSS Courier surfaced in 1972, when an anonymous letter reached the U.S. Embassy in Vienna. Postmarked from Innsbruck, it contained a single sentence typed in German: Der Morgenstern ist gefallen, aber leuchtet noch. The morning star has fallen, but it still shines. No sender was identified, and the embassy's follow-up investigation found nothing. Today, the official record of Project Morgenstern consists of a handful of declassified OSS memos, a missing persons file for Lieutenant Harlan and Sergeant Rizzo, and the unexplained 1958 USAF document request bearing Falkenhayn's name. The journals have never resurfaced. The possibility remains that they were seized by the Soviets, destroyed in the Alps, or hidden in an archive where the label has long since been changed. The unanswered question is whether Morgenstern was simply a wartime fantasy, or whether, somewhere, its principles were quietly tested under the cover of another nation's sky. Long after the last gun fell silent, the machinery of secrecy kept turning, grinding evidence into dust, rewriting the battlefield into something clean enough for textbooks. Yet in the margins between the smudged stamps and the missing names, you can still feel it, the pulse of something hidden, watching, waiting, and perhaps not entirely finished.